My name is Piers Turner, and I'm co-director of the Center for Ethics and Human Values, which is a university-wide center on campus where we try to promote ethical reflection and discussion across differences and disciplines through a variety of programs, a lot of it student-facing. We're really grateful for you all to be here. I'm just like, I can't say how pleased and honored I am to be introducing Darrick Hamilton today. One thing Darrick taught me during his time at Ohio State was to lead with gratitude. And so let me first say I'm really grateful for you all for coming out today for this and supporting this event and hearing what Darrick has to say. I'm also very grateful to the organizers of this event. We have, of course, important staff. Kate McFarland, for any of the speakers who are here, is just instrumental in pulling this together. Erin Yarmel, our associate director, also played a big role, and so I'm grateful to them. But most of all, I'm grateful to Darrick for coming back to Ohio State. I should say Darrick is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School. He's also the chief economist at the AFL-CIO. But previously, he was the executive director of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity here at Ohio State. And in that capacity, he also had a primary appointment in the John Glenn College of Public Affairs, with courtesy appointments in economics and sociology. And during that time, when Darrick was here, he made a really big impact on many people, but maybe more than anyone else, me. I just really enjoyed getting to know Darrick and also learning from Darrick. And when we first met each other, we were on this Rhodes Scholar Tour, where Ohio State assembles a bunch of academics, puts them in a bus, and drives them around the state. So it's like Rhodes Scholar. Exactly. And shows them bits of Ohio, right? Because there's these 88 counties, and the idea is we should get out there and get to know Ohio. And I think Darrick was sitting down first, but anyway, I sat down next to him, and I didn't know who he was, he didn't know who I was. Over the next couple of days on this tour, I learned that Darrick receives calls from national news organizations on a regular basis asking for his comment, and I do not. And we talked about all kinds of things, and it was just a really wonderful experience sitting next to Darrick on that trip. Part of what was inspiring about his time at Ohio State for me was that right around the same time we were starting a new major in College of Arts and Sciences called Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, PPE, which has been around for a long time at lots of universities, but was new to Ohio State. And it was really important to see in Darrick a kind of model for the way in which you want to bring values together with the social sciences and specifically economics for thinking about the big problems of today. And that was precisely what we were trying to do and still try to do with our students in the PPE program. And so to just be able to spend time with Darrick where he was just like modeling exactly what we were hoping to get out of our students from whatever end of the political spectrum, right, in terms of how big their thinking was, but also how specific their thinking could be in terms of trying to offer solutions to the big problems. I just learned so much just by being around Darrick for a couple of years. So I'm just really grateful that he came back to be part of this with us today. So let me just finish introducing him. As I've mentioned, he's now moved on to the New School in a distinguished professorship there. And so why did we invite him for this conference on the future of work? Well, Darrick's work examines all kinds of things around the intersection of social stratification, power, and political economy, in scholarship and practice and policy, all as they relate to promoting economic inclusion, social equity, and civic engagement. And he's received a lot of attention, as I just mentioned, both academic and in the media, with spotlights in places like the New York Times, Mother Jones, Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal. Partly because some of the things he's proposed include things like baby bonds was maybe the thing he was most famous for initially, but he's also been a real proponent of a certain kind of guaranteed income scheme and a federal job guarantee. And so when we're thinking about the future of work in the context of all of these issues around equity and social stratification and work in the future, I couldn't think of a better person than Darrick to join us today. There's a number of other things I could say about his accolades and things he's done. He was appointed as a member of the Economic Committee of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force, if you all can remember back to 2020 when that happened, and he's testified before Senate and House committees in a number of contexts, and he's also been named as a fellow by a number of different think tanks and institutes where he's writing and researching with them. I think he'd want me to tell you that he was born and raised in Bedford-Stuyvesant. It's a big, Darrick always remembers where he's coming from, and it's a big part of his story. He also attended Oberlin for his BA, and he got his PhD at UNC at Chapel Hill, same as me, but not at the same time. But maybe we could have known each other much longer. So with that, maybe too personal and slightly embarrassing introduction for me, not for him, let me just say again, please join me in welcoming Darrick Hamilton to Ohio State.
So I do get moved sometimes. I'm going to avoid the tears. I can certainly say that my brief time with Piers is so endearing. That trip on that bus was cathartic, as well as just enriching of all the things that I think of an entity like the Center on Ethics and Human Values can represent, which is an exchange of ideas grounded in integrity with a foundation of value. So we didn't agree on everything on that trip, and I'd say some things. He'd say, "Really, you believe that?" And then we'd go back and forwards. But I think the discourse was such that neither one of us doubted the place of just straight up honesty and commitment to justice. My time at Ohio State was transformative for me. I grew from a scholar to a public intellectual, and the engagement with the Kirwan Institute and some people in this room certainly facilitated me in an accelerated way to be a public intellectual that Piers described in that introduction. And it feels good to be back on campus. It feels really good to be back here. So I'm going to talk about a few things, the future of work, and an obvious thing when one thinks about future of work is our technological evolution. Not going to spend a lot of time on that, but a key thing when we think about technology, AI, and the various things that are revolutionary with regards to change is the political economy absorption of it. We focus a lot on the technology itself, but as to whether it's going to be exploitive, extractive, or empowering, which we should emphasize as well, has a lot to do with the political economic context by which it's absorbed. We know that its development is poised to supercharge our already concentrated wealth and potentially be anti-democratic in the capacity of that wealth to translate into political capture. We know that it's being used right now in ways that low-wage workforces, their jobs are becoming more repetitive, precarious, and remunerative, but it need not have to be that way. We know that with artificial general intelligence, the idea that the machines, the learning will be such that they'll be able to do tasks as well as Nobel laureates in a much more expedient way, a lot quicker. Well, that type of evolution, when it occurs, if it occurs, will be juxtaposed against a different group, this group with power, more so than low-wage workers, and it'll be interesting to see how that technology is absorbed. So what I'm going to focus on most today is the future of work and the intersections of democracy, our economy, and identity group stratification, the ways in which all of those things are intertwined and going to have a profound influence on the future of work. If we want to understand the future of work, we have to grapple with and grasp the past. Any contemporary phenomena, any projected phenomena, if one views it without a historical lens, you will be myopic, you will be misled. So we will look towards history a little bit when thinking about this question. I will ultimately propose a value system, a commitment to an economy that centers people and the environments in which we live. And I'm also going to do a little critique of my discipline of economics. Its purported positivist nature that does not recognize the normative values by which it infuses. And then finally, I'll also make the point that our government has always dictated winners and losers. There's no such thing as small government. Government is always activist, and the ways in which it's activated will have influence on the winners and losers of society. All right, so the gross and obscene concentration of wealth is wreaking havoc on our democracy, as well as our collective visioning to establish and implement a more just and inclusive workplace and society in general. The ability of the extreme rich to capture government is anti-democratic, and it's antithetical to a just and inclusive society. Basically, economic inclusion and authentic democracy is stymied because our nation's wealth, power, resources, media, educational curricula, technological surveillance, prisons, business and capital ownership, and virtually all of our institutions are owned, managed, and controlled by a select few billionaires, and based on this trend, in the not-so-distant future, trillionaires. Elon Musk and Doge, his ownership of Twitter, his influence through campaign finance reform, his ability to influence and impact our government are, to me, case in point and obvious examples. But to be clear, I do not begrudge the wealthy because of their wealth per se, but rather I begrudge how readily that wealth translates into political power. So I'm going to talk a lot about our contemporary moment. As President Trump promises to, quote, make America great again and return to a, quote, better time, it's evident that his brand of divisive, identity-stratifying politics, it's embedded in the economic and social fabric of our country. The inauguration of Donald Trump's second term coinciding on MLK's birthday or celebration of his birthday is not just a coincidence. It's an ironic polarity of two contrasting visions for America's workforce, and it demands our attention. In a short period of time while in office, the market reaction to President Donald Trump's domestic and foreign policy agenda has been a steep drop accompanied by a contraction of GDP. Noteworthy, this downward trend in GDP may be accompanied by an unusual combination of a rising trend in prices, which may drive our economy into stagflation, high inflation, and economic contraction. The blunt, non-precise, ubiquitous use and threat of tariffs is destabilizing and inflationary. Broadly speaking, the Trump foreign policy approach leading to a contraction and isolation of American workers and firms from global markets and security, and the embargo and cuts on USAID is risking dire resources towards those that need it the most. It's a potential squander of whatever goodwill and leadership that may have amassed to the United States post-World War II. A more just use of tariffs would be to fight the flight of capital as it engages in a global search and race to the bottom for the most exploitable and extractive conditions of workers, and instead use tariffs with the intent of promoting humane and productive fair wages with dignified working conditions for workers both here and abroad. I mean, I dare say the Marshall Plan that came out of World War II was our best foreign policy. The goal of rebuilding Europe's infrastructure and promoting not only the infrastructure and the avoidance of a World War III, but tranquility, stabilizing migration, I think was a tried and tested policy that worked. Its problem was that it was not inclusive. It included Western Europe, but not the rest of the world, which also was very much involved in World War II and in need of that type of intervention. Moreover, it benefited the United States. I'm going to skip a little long rather than keep talking about what Trump is doing. But I'll say the accelerating and trending deterioration of Americans' economic and social public infrastructure is exactly what Dr. King fought hard to warn us about all those years ago. We must reckon that Trump's continued electoral success lays bare our nation's fears, vulnerabilities, and divisions that sustained his popularity. Well, that is a symptom, not a cause. It is a symptom of a bipartisan economy by both Democrats and Republicans that has failed to promote economic security and prosperity for most Americans. President Trump's playbook leverages a tried and tested tool, a political and economic appeal to one's relative status. We can look to the work of sociologists like Herbert Blumer in his seminal article, Race Prejudice as a Sense of Group Positioning, and critical race theorists like Cheryl Harris's article, Whiteness as Property, as well as the emergent subfield of identity group stratification in economics, which I situate myself as an understanding of this playbook. We understand that relative status, often legally and socially enforced by the state, can provide individuals with a sense of psychological solace and economic advantage vis-a-vis or relative to individuals from another group. Its power is grounded in vulnerability. The greater the social despair, insecurity, and absolute inequality, the greater the political, economic, and psychological appeal to one's relative status. The strategy has deep roots tracing as far back as Barry Goldwater's run for president, using his Southern strategy, where appeals to whiteness of Southern voters were made in a context of the relative gains that followed the civil rights movement led by Dr. King. Barry Goldwater's campaign slogan for president was a similar phrase that I bet everyone can recognize, quote, return to a simpler time. Trump has refined, evolved, and amplified these appeals, offering to his voters a sense of restored status in exchange for their political allegiance. It's noteworthy that this appeal to relative status is not limited to race. His campaign strategically targeted young men by positioning patriarchy and the traditional male roles in a household as under threat, and nativity is another obvious layer of identity leveraged by the Trump campaign, a point of division by which Black and Latino voters were not immune. Still, it would intellectually and tactically be a big mistake to surmise Trump's appeal as simply rooted in ignorance, rooted in hate, or failures of our public education system, or some sort of cultural wars. Appeals to relative status are effective precisely because they tap into economic grievance, precarity, and loss. So over the last 4 decades, 50% of Americans saw negligible wealth gains, while the wealth of the top 1% grew by 500%. Half of Americans hold less than 2% of our nation's massive wealth. The vast majority of Americans have been negatively impacted by real wage stagnation, a yawning wage to productivity gap, and growing wealth inequality, as well as policies that have systematically undervalued work. So while Trump absorbs our attention with feuds grounded in our differences, both economic and political power continue to consolidate amongst the top while excluding and mitigating our collective action to address our looming and evident existential crises such as climate catastrophe, migrant crises, and violent global conflict. There's an alternative approach. A more enlightened approach is an economy and an industrial policy that focuses and promotes human flourishing, civic engagement, and advances tranquility, and authentically enables us with affirmative inclusion of all groups to be self-determining in righteous ways. That is an economy that centers people and the environments in which we live and systematically invests public resources towards them, where people are not simply viewed as consumer agents to whom resources might be redistributed to redress inequality in a charitable sense, but rather one with the conception that when properly resourced, people are innovative and productive agents that make dynamic contributions that benefit themselves, the economy overall, and promotes tranquility and safe and inclusive environments. This means ensuring that people have the necessary economic resources to be productive: housing, healthcare, income, jobs, capital, education, all those things that they need to thrive. Essentially, what I'm talking about is not so new, nor is it radical. It's a 21st century economic version of A. Philip Randolph's and Bayard Rustin's freedom budget. Dr. King wrote the foreword for that budget, but it, along with many other documents, we can look at FDR's Four Freedoms as examples of commitments and values and indications of the ways in which government should invest to promote tranquility. So let's talk a little bit about race and political economy. The structures of this political economy go well beyond class and individual bigotry. As a matter of course, race and other social identities, they are weaponized to strategically generate hierarchy and propel systems of poverty, stratification, and persistent inequality. Right? The more unequal we are, people hone in on relative status, and there's a trade-off between the two. So despite secular improvements in racial disparities in education and income, at least up to the mid-1970s, when it comes to wealth, the racial wealth gap has largely remained unchanged since we've been systematically collecting information on wealth. The empirical reality is that race-based disparities persist and even widen with higher socioeconomic attainment. So I'm making the point that racial disparities can't be reduced to class reductionism. The limited explanatory power of education, and hence human capital, and the extent to the racialized nature of Americans' political economy goes well beyond wealth. So we know, I can give you some quick data points, that if you look at health disparities between black and white people, in general, between the ages of 25 and 64, there's about a 50% greater mortality rate for a black individual. So that's tragic, but perhaps not surprising. If I look at it for those that have a college degree, that disparity between black and white college-educated individuals goes to 70%. It's not atypical that a head of household who's black with a college degree has less wealth than a white head of household who's dropped out of college. The unemployment rate for black people is typically twice that of white workers, irrespective of their age and education. And in terms of earnings, black workers are paid less than white counterparts, irrespective of their social and economic characteristics. Moreover, when we have scarcity across business cycles, racial disparities widen, and they widen more for those with higher levels of education. further emphasizing the role of social identity hierarchy in establishing distribution of socially desired outcomes, and how that sorting becomes even more magnified in the throes of a recession. So I'm not anti-education. I'm anti-exaggerating it as the panacea to address some of our structurally established barriers. I'm going to skip ahead because I want to make sure we get to questions and answers, but I will say this is absolutely detrimental to a well-functioning democracy. More broadly, households in general with few assets and low incomes are compelled to turn to high-cost, unconventional, and alternative financial products. They generally are aware that these products are predatory, but they have little to no other alternatives. These last resort debt traps render the borrowers indentured, having to pay higher and higher interest rates and fees until ultimately they default on the original principal. So the way we manage poor people in America is we treat them as surplus populations. Rather than promoting their income mobility, we engage in subsistence programs or income maintenance programs. We socially isolate them. We conscript them to our military. We incarcerate them en masse, and we engage in policies aimed at controlling their reproduction, their fertility, and their family formation. We characterize them as persistently unemployed and unemployable, a source of urban crime and malice, and whose subsistence needs we deem a drain on our fiscal budgets. My discipline of economics is a big part of this conceptual problem. It presents, when it purports itself to be a science, an innuendo of a purity devoid of politics, use of power, and the tribalism that we have constantly seen across space and time throughout human history. All scholarship, all public policy, all remedies begin with a normative set of values. That's not a general critique. It's simply a statement of fact. A fact that opens the door for productive and critical engagement with any program, structure, or policy, any identification or framing of what is and is not a problem, as well as any purported solution to that problem. The economic conception of freedom and fairness grounded in individual price takers at baseline, it does not adequately take into account the roles of power and capital and the uneven distribution of power and capital, especially when we're trying to understand group-based disparity. The discipline provides an intellectual framing of our proverbial American narrative, as well as the equal opportunity ruse, that through hard work and effort, all individuals can turn their proverbial rags into riches. The political and economic effect of this ethos is that it absolves the state, as well as other structures in our society, for the conditions and remedy of the poor and Black economic underdevelopment, and instead shifts the locus and onus of this disparity onto the poor and Black people themselves. In this formulation, any attempt by the state to exert stimulus or regulatory influence on economic relationships is considered an interference, a distortion, a deviation from some natural order. That is to say, the state cannot deliver what heroic individuals can themselves accomplish when left to their own devices. If Black and poor people would only engage in more productive behaviors and habits, they would be able to capture a greater share of America's vast wealth. Nothing can be further from the truth. From the beginning of the American project, our government has proactively shaped our economy, determining who reaps the benefit of capital flows and economic prosperity. From, for example, the 19th century import tariffs and infrastructure investments that nurtured our fledgling domestic industrial base, while at the same time fugitive slave laws enshrined racial structure of work and ownership, to, in that time, US government's genocidal displacement of indigenous people from their homelands made way for the Homestead Act, which transferred those lands largely to white families free of charge. The proactive role that our government has played in determining winners and losers, especially by race, should be undeniable. The racial wealth gap, income inequality, wage stagnation, and the persistence of poverty that characterize the American economy, they are not natural, nor are they accidental. They are the direct and deliberate result of laws, practice, and policy, both past and present, designed to serve specific interests. There's no amount of individual economic effort that can overturn the centuries-long programs of resource hoarding among the wealthy and powerful few, supported by a political economy that offers a dominant political group, which predominantly is white, with some black exceptions, relative status anchored by otherness, defined by blackness. So that's a dismal description of where we are and how we got there. There's good news. We do have collective agency. Our agency lies in political power and collective bargaining. Ultimately, our economy is a choice. We get to define and determine values. Our current economic system, couched myopically and almost exclusively in the value of self-interested accumulation, has left us vulnerable to greed and exploitation and the despotic political weaponization of race, gender, and identity group differences more broadly. Growth, as the explicit expression of economic well-being, in isolation, it fails to adequately capture the multiple dimensions of prosperity. So we should begin with a question. In determining how to define structures and direct our public resources with a purpose of promoting economic and industrial activity, first and foremost, we should simply ask a fundamental question: what is the purpose of an economy? And then secondarily, what is government's role in achieving that purpose? The purpose of an economy should be to promote our productive capacities, advance tranquility and human flourishing, and enable people to be self-determining in righteous ways. And the role of government should be to set the rules and steward public resources to achieve that purpose. Economic inclusion, social equity, and civic engagement are values that should be front and center for our economy and democracy to both be healthy and thrive. Although not complete or perfect, there is a blueprint. Over 75 years ago, an international coalition led by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, convened by the United Nations, issued a landmark universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Declaration, it's important to understand, came out of a political context of the atrocities of the Second World War and the economic destabilization that preceded it. It was meant to promote human flourishing and tranquility at a time when despair within and among nation states was ubiquitous. The Declaration identified 5 categories: civil rights, political rights, social rights, cultural rights, and economic rights. In isolation, any subset of those human rights are inadequate. I'll go a step further and say they are a co-optation of notions of rights and freedom. Over time, economic rights has become the one category that's lost most of its momentum. Whether we realize them or not in our society, civil and political aspects of human rights are ingrained in our public psyche. However, at least as important has to be economic rights. This became increasingly clear to Dr. King in his final days. By the late 1960s, towards the twilight of his life, King had become explicit about the essential connections between economic rights, freedom, and racial justice. In his own words, he said, I am now convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now and widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income. King's call for a federal job guarantee, guaranteed income, and even reparations reflected his belief that, broadly speaking, poverty was a moral failing of the nation, and for people to truly be free, they required resources. So his 1968 Poor People's Campaign sought to build solidarity across racial lines, uniting poor people in the pursuit of economic security and prosperity. And his explicit call for reparations for Black people was also indicative that his view of economic rights and racial justice were not so separable. Tragically, and perhaps not coincidentally, King's life was cut short in 1968 before this phase of his vision, with an emphasis on economic rights, could fully be realizing, leaving a profound legacy of unfinished work. So the institute that I direct, that Piers referenced, that my great colleague Sapana Bhaskaran is also with us, we're working with our senior fellow, Ohio's own Senator Nina Turner, on a revitalized 21st century version of the Freedom Budget. So we hope it becomes a tool to reassert economic rights within the framework of human rights, to recover the economic rights tradition from the civil rights movement, and to reorient contemporary political and Black political discourse in particular around economic rights, to highlight the inseparability of identity stratification, economics, and politics, and the need for economic rights and affirmative inclusion to fight our divisive or fascist tendencies, to redress the marginalization of women. So one of the problems we can redress from history was we know that the civil rights movement marginalized women's voices. So Senator Turner, as a spokesperson, will not be silent. And finally, to revise the Freedom Budget to meet the demands, context, and challenges of our contemporary political economy. So let me continue with this history. So starting in the 1970s, with the neoliberal revolution and the narrowing of our understanding of human rights to political and civil rights, and rights pertaining to the protection of property, industrial policy began to focus on firms and on a zero-sum, winner-take-all, nation-state competition in our international sphere. Although we may not conceive of them as such, deregulation, government outsourcing, privatization, corporate tax cuts, and the outright corporate subsidies, they amount to a strategic direction of resources to impact economic activity and outcomes, and are indeed a form of industrial policy. Indeed, an argument could be made that despite the rhetoric of small government, the Reagan administration, with its deregulation, union-busting activities, and corporate tax cuts, represented a massive and active strategic shift in government resources, both political and economic resources, towards corporate interests and away from labor and the industrial, with both industrial and economic purposes in mind. So this type of industrial policy is antithetical to shared human flourishing and leaves us vulnerable to an economic context of fear, despair, and growing inequality, both within and across nation states. It is the very situation that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights sought to address in the first place. The rhetorical illusion and elegance around words like freedom, choice, and a specific notion of rights, not the economic rights of people, but the economic rights of property. It's a rhetoric devoid of an honest reckoning with the immoral practices by which that property came to be distributed in the first place. We know that without resources, individuals are largely restricted from benefiting from economic markets, and instead are left to the whim of charity or the vulnerability of exploitation of to agents in that market that have resources. So investing in human capacities, a la Nobel laureate winning economist Amartya Sen's human capabilities approach, not only should be a primary purpose of government in first instance, but also turns out to generate positive externalities and productive macroeconomic multipliers that benefit the overall economy as well. Moreover, investments in healthy and renewable environmental assets, those are necessary precursors to healthy democracies, productive living, and tranquility, especially over time. So to be clear, our political economy has come to naturalize poverty and inequality by castigating it as the result of unproductive and deficient behavior. That is, subpar outcomes are seen as resulting from personal choices of individuals and their communities. Our industrial policy and regulatory environments should promote an economy that centers people and the environments in which they live, basically a human rights economy. And these investments need to be made permanent and intentionally inclusive of all racial, ethnic, and social identity groups. An inclusive economic rights frame turns all of this on its head by locating poverty and inequality as resulting from an absence of resources. That is, poverty and inequality are the result of policy choices that deny people the resources they need to live meaningful lives. So let me get to conclusions. Ultimately, pessimism, cynicism, and inaction will not reverse our trends of economic consolidation, divisive politics, and our inability to adequately address our collective crises like climate change and the absorption of technological innovation. King famously wrote from a Birmingham jail cell that, quote, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice." Exerting claim on our economy requires building movements and organizations that can exact demands and conditions that truly empower all people with the resources they need to authentically be self-determining. Dr. King and his civil rights partners had the economic foresight to know that in order to fight against the conditions that facilitated Donald Trump's strongman brand of divisive politics, we must defang that which gives it its power. An economy grounded in despair, risk, insecurity, and the growing chasm between the haves and the have-nots. Now is always the time to build on the lessons of Dr. King and shift our prevailing paradigm towards a more inclusive, just, and prosperous democracy and future with the strategic direction of public resources towards people, workers, and sustainable environments for both industrial and economic purposes. Essentially a 21st century version of Dr. King's political economic vision that stemmed from his early civil rights days that focused on voting and integration into his Poor People campaign days in the late 1960s that focused on economic justice and inclusive economic rights writ large. So the final message is that ultimately the power lies within us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're going to jump right into audience Q&A. I will lead with one question while people are lining up, but we have a microphone right over there, so please just form a line if you have questions for Dr. Hamilton. While people are lining up, let me just ask one question, which is, when I introduced you, I mentioned that there are at least 3 different kinds of specific policies that you've become known for baby bonds, a kind of guaranteed income, and a federal jobs guarantee. And I guess I'm just, in the context of everything you just laid out, which was in a very big picture way, I'm curious if you would want to pick up on one of those and just explain as an example, like why that's the right kind of solution then, given the kind of problems you've laid out.
And I'll say also that we need all of them, right? An economic rights portfolio is a set of goods and services, and here's the key distinction from any other good, without which you don't have agency in your lives. And we can name what some of them are. Healthcare, if you're sick and you can't afford to see a doctor, that's not free. If you are unhoused, if you are hungry, if you don't have a quality education in the 21st century, or at least access to one without the albatross of student debt from grade school all the way through college, that's not free. So these are enabling goods and services whose quantity, quality, and access should not be rationed by a price mechanism, should be set with public options to ensure inclusion. So the list is not ad infinitum, but goods that basically any highly inelastic goods that are critical for one to have agency. And again, this is not even handouts or charity, to literally be able to do productive things. These are what I mean by economic rights. So, I've said a lot about baby bonds to redress the racial wealth gap and wealth inequality in general. There's a lot of asset poor white individuals as well as black individuals, a lot more black individuals, that don't have the necessary resource to get into an asset which will passively appreciate over their life. So most Americans that generate wealth do so because they get into an asset, and here's the key word, that passively appreciates over their life. The difference between a homeowner and a renter is often a down payment. The difference between an entrepreneur and a worker is often grounded in capital. The ability to take your idea and bring it to the marketplace as opposed to having to go to somebody else with your idea. So baby bonds is an example of a birthright to capital. It says that regardless of the family, the economic situation in which you're born into, it ensures that when you become a young adult, you get access to some capital that's been set aside by the government for investment purposes. And that's the idea that I'm trying to get across with economic rights in general. Why is it that any ledger on a federal budget or even in our taxes that goes to people, we think of them as costs, but resources going to firms, we think of them as investments? Well, I believe people are dynamic contributors to our economy. So that's a normative perspective. So with this inclusive economic right, like baby bonds, not only will it enable people who otherwise don't have a birthright to access wealth and all the rewards that come along with it, which, by the way, wealth, the power of wealth, is the functionality of it, what wealth can do for you. So with wealth, if I want to quit my job today and go pursue, I'm going to put my friend Dante on the spot, who's a great cook. And then if I wanted to be a cook and could cook like him, he does a whole lot of things. He's not only a cook, but if I had the culinary skills of him, I couldn't do so without wealth. So baby bonds is, and I know I'm talking a lot. Social Security might be our most successful public policy program. That's an economic right to a pension. We as a society said that you work all your life, you should be afforded the dignity of a pension in the twilight of your life. Well, baby bonds in some ways is a continuation of Social Security. We have nothing for young adults that are beginning a lifetime of building economic security beyond income maintenance or subsistence programs. It says that you get to start out with a nest egg that can promote your family formation, that can promote your capabilities to do almost anything. So that's the idea behind it.
Thank you, Dr. Hamilton, for the great talk. I learned a lot. And my name is Filiz. I'm from education field. And I realized that you used flourishing several times in your talk, and even describing the aim of economy, you mentioned that human flourishing. So in education, as an educational goal, I have an idea of what human flourishing may be. How do you define broadly in economical field? What do you mean by human flourishing?
Yeah, and part of the point is we all get to choose, right? So I presented to you some of my normative set of values, but one of the things we need to do is demystify the economy and socialize people to understand that it is grounded in a normative set of values, and collectively we get to define what our economy is. So one problem we have is that I don't think widely people believe that. So they accept what the dogma and understanding of what an economy is, and it's mostly grounded in this self-interested value, this self-interested accumulation. So for me, human flourishing includes a lot of things. One is some self-determination. The other would be some tranquility, love. So a second ago in my answer about baby bonds, I talked about family formation as an output of wealth, right? So why do many families end up in divorce? It often is grounded in finances. So why don't we get to define love as a human value that we want as a purpose of our economy, and also to promote human flourishing? A lot of times the narrative is family formation dictates economic outcomes. We actually get to choose. We can flip that relationship and argue that to a large extent, well-resourced people have agency to choose the partner they want, the love that they want, and live in tranquility. So those would be examples of my ideas of human flourishing.
Hello, Professor Hamilton. Thank you so much for your talk. I wanted to get an opportunity to kind of hear about this kind of dichotomous nature that I hear you describe about the history of America and how we have, as a country, chosen our winners and losers over the economy, and learn a little bit more about how, what mechanisms need to be in place in terms of either like local or national, because I know Vermont just picked up baby bonds, right? So what mechanisms need to be in place either locally or nationally to enact some of these policies that you've come up with? Because I think they're really, really good, but there's this contention between like, will we do this based on what you laid out among like what the country has been doing since its inception, particularly around to Black people or marginalized people. So I wanted to kind of just learn about what those mechanisms would need to be for these things to be tangible in a way that we could go out and, like Vermont, pick up baby bonds at a national or local level.
Yeah, no, good question. So the main agency is political. The main agency it is our government, it is our economy, and the U.S. has a very powerful monetary system that allows us to make choices. So ours means that through collective action and bargaining, we do get to choose. So that's the mechanism. But I'm hearing some other things in the question, which is we can point to history and see periods in which we have made a great deal of progress. When it comes to wealth, I'm going to say Black people really have not made progress. But in many other dimensions, from the period of 1945 at least to the mid-70s, dramatic progress. Some of it had to do with a policy infrastructure around a great society. A lot of it had to do with the civil rights movement, which from its origins was about economic rights. If we go to like A. Philip Randolph, that planned March on Washington for Jobs had been incubating for a long time. There's a history of black people involved in unions and collective bargaining. So there has been an empirical increase or reduction in relative racial inequality. It stopped in the mid-'70s. And I try to argue that it stopped because there was a new paradigm, which I'm labeling as neoliberalism, and I could say more about that. But prior to that, coming out of World War II, I think we had a moment in history where government began to invest in people and the places in which they live. And I can cite specific policies, but it was done in an imperfect, incomplete way. It was done in such a way, there's a great book by the historian Ira Katz-Nelson called When Affirmative Action Was White, which goes through and details how the New Deal legislation didn't explicitly say black people didn't have access, but do things like when Social Security was originally legislated, it excluded domestic and agricultural workers. Well, who were domestic and agricultural workers? Chicanos and blacks. 90% of black women engaged in work was a domestic or agricultural worker, and over half of black men. Well, that was a design feature, and it was part of a Faustian bargain that we can get into in order to get it legislated. The Southern legislators had a grand bargain with Roosevelt. We label a Faustian bargain that allowed for the Jim Crow hierarchy to remain intact. So that was an imperfection we should learn from. That is, even today, when we think about movements and you ask people to compromise their identity for some expediency around class coalition, I would argue it's not sustainable because it leaves open the door for another economic crisis. And by the way, a lot of this was driven by crises. So it was the crises of World War II that allowed for a new enlightened period. It was the crises of the Great Depression that allowed for a new enlightened period. We know we're going to face a lot of crises in this time period with all the volatility, so we need to be ready. We need to be ready with political movement, momentum, in order to build up the strategy and the muscles so when the moment occurs, we can get something different. And I guess what I'm also saying is that we have to make sure that it is intentionally inclusive, or we remain open to the idea that a strong man can come in the next crisis and utilize it in a way to pit us against each other, and that democracy power, which includes a majority of us, can be usurped.
Thank you, Dr.
Always good to hear you.
I'm in trouble. Trevon's about to ask a question.
I have two questions, of course. So, but I like both the things that you're weaving, and they respond to sort of, or reactions to both parts of what you're talking about. The first is as you're talking about the current state of policies and so the reformation that's going on right now. And just interested in hearing your thoughts that I've been sort of impressed with people talking about this new establishment of rentier capitalism in this new regime and how that relates to the future of work and automation and the creation of oligarchies as it relates to the use of the government in a capitalist system, right, to derive rents for a very select few. And then the second piece is you're talking about sort of the policy apparatus here to think about the new research in economics about guaranteed income and the way that that research has been framed in terms of labor supply effects and other sorts of effects, and how, more specifically, your critique of economics could apply to that specific literature, which is looking at one of the policy solutions you were talking about.
So I feel like giving them a fist bump. I thought he was going to hit. Those were generous questions. I appreciate that. Trump's economic plan is revolutionary. And the rentier economics that Trevon described is the product of a growing inequality that's been going on for a long run that has left us vulnerable for this new type of revolution. The difference between the haves and the have-nots has persisted for so long that there is a fed-upness by which it facilitated this new paradigm. But there's some good news. The good news is if we do a tale of two recoveries and investigate the ways in which we engaged in the Great Recession versus the pandemic recession, we did some revolutionary things during this pandemic. We sent checks by way of the IRS directly to the American people multiple times with substantial amounts. We told employers who had workforces that if you applied for these loans, and we did it in a clumsily way, we will guarantee these loans and forgive them if you keep your payroll. Imagine if we didn't do those things. We suspended student loans repayment. We stopped evictions, foreclosures during this period. So we did things different this time than we did during the Great Recession. And we didn't have that sustained oxymoronic recovery that was jobless. This time we had the shortest recession on record. This time, in a short period of time, not only did the economy recover, it grew. We didn't sustain it. We didn't make the programs permanent. We had the refundable child tax credit and we let it expire. Inflation ruled the day, so we had a political messaging problem. And that's not to be insensitive to the rising prices that people experience, but we'd be naive to not think that there'd be some inflation when we literally halt an economy to preserve lives. And I know Trevon could talk about a lot of the firm price gouging that took place as well. So I guess one could say, how were we able to do that in this economic downturn? I think a lot of it had to do with the political agitation that was taking place leading up to it. From the Me Too movement, from Occupy Wall Street to Black Lives Matter, it led to a different reaction of the political, economic leaders in power than it did in the past. But it also is indicative of a vulnerability of rentier economics. Oh, and guaranteed income. So guaranteed income, my good colleague and friend is pointing out that a lot of the guaranteed income, the conventional economics says that if you offer people income, they will choose more leisure and work less. So there's a great deal of evidence suggesting that the people who receive this guaranteed income are actually working more. And they're able to do more things that they might have not been able to do before, like engage with their children more as well, but also be able to afford things like transportation and childcare to facilitate work. So the research that's coming out now in terms of the guaranteed income positions it the way I think it should be positioned, which is as an investment, not as something that might deter irresponsible behavior that conventional economics might predict.
So, if you have a question, go ahead.
So I hear a lot recently about free college, and I just wonder if that is one of the programs that you're in favor of, or if you think that these other, like universal basic income is like an alternative to that, or just where do you stand on the free college idea that's become pretty popular?
Yeah, and I want to give a slight critique of UBI. I like guaranteed income, but I'm concerned with UBI, the universal nature of giving everybody the same amount. And by the way, baby bonds is getting bipartisan support to some extent, but I fear the idea might get co-opted. So some of the right proposals are saying, let's give every child $1,000 at birth and that's it. Well, if you make it universal and lose the progressive nature of it, one, that might be the definition of inflation. Two, those people that already have resources, you basically will subsidize their assets to get even more resources. So, I'd say be careful with the universality in the administration of it. The political universality, fine, that's great. Social Security is wonderful in large part because it's universal. but it's also progressive. I'm definitely supportive of tuition-free college. And this is the point. So a lot of times, here's a critique that I'd put on the progressive approach to political economy. We often get so myopic in our specific policies that we end up fighting with each other over our specific policies without some overarching vision. There's a strong conception of justice that neoliberalism puts out, and it's eloquent. It's attractive. It's a story of agency. It's a clear North Star vision of what freedom and justice is. I don't think it's authentic because it's missing the critical ingredient of resources, but the progressive side doesn't really have a story about economic justice. So to me, thinking about this vision of industrial policy that centers people and environment and human rights economy, that has to go along with the policies. So then if it goes along with the policies and somebody says guaranteed income or tuition-free public education quality from grade school all the way through college, your answer is both. Your answer is those are two critical dimensions of agency that we need.
First of all, thank you for this. This is a great cap off for the day of thinking about where the world is going to take us. So I am going to pose a question that's essentially bringing together some ties that will end with, well, what should we do? But to bring that all together, I heard my colleague asking a question about like, okay, if these are policy proposals, how do we get to a position where we're in a place to make those policy proposals and changes? And I hear you to be saying something along the lines of like getting ready with a political movement. You've relied on collective action. You were just responding to the most recent question saying we need to have a better narrative, or like the progressive side needs to have a better narrative when it comes to their talking points and what it looks like to refer to something like economic rights by way of a vision that actually ties to people and the experiences that they have. So we've got a great opportunity here at a university to have these sorts of conversations, but I would just invite you to say a little bit more about where do we go from here? If we've got some of these talking points, but we aren't yet at the place where we have what you were referring to as existing political agitation that you were suggesting is what made the progressive reforms in response to the pandemic recession more effective than they were in the Great Recession. What does it look like to get ourselves into a space where, not that we need to like recreate the like Me Too movement or the BLM movement, like those were somehow like archetype of what we could do, but what does it look like to seek that political agitation that might get us in a position to do these political proposals or the policy proposals that you're suggesting in ways that actually might be action guiding for us right now, given the lack of agency some of us have as individuals and kind of moves towards collective action without having the reins of political power. Thanks.
Yeah, and you said a lot of it, and I agree with it, which is definitely collective action. Individually, we can be isolated and picked apart. But that said, if we think about a group with power, we have tenure in the academy, and we know that that's still vulnerable. But I could tell you some personal choices I'm trying to make, and then some of this just becomes personal. The thing to hone in on is collective power is often and always better than individual power. So my work with AFL-CIO, I'm trying to be opportunistic a little bit. I'm hoping that if I have insights on a North Star vision that can help articulate justice with this institute that I'm directing, and I have a whole lot of capable people with me, that would be one goal. Another goal would be that we infuse into the labor movement a notion of identity group inclusion, a recognition that if it just becomes class reduction, we still will be vulnerable to the same tactics that mitigated the successes from the past. So those are two things that I'm trying to do. What else? It is a movement, so we try to build everybody in. The artists will be a lot more creative than I can ever be and messaging and trying to get people in. But I definitely want to emphasize that this is our moment in time. So I would say that those that are committed to justice, now more than ever is the time to commit. I can tell you from my personal approaches, it's never been enough scholarship for the sake of information creation and producing. And, some of that is values. Without a doubt, my identity is grounded in being a scholar. I'm drawn to it. I love it. That's my passion. But it's not enough. So I would say that now is our moment. And I can hear from your question, you already committed to it, that now is the moment for us to step up.
So I came up here without a clock. I have oh, there is a clock back there. Good, so we still have a good bit of time. Please.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking today. So I'm coming from more of a structural econ perspective, and I'm deeply in agreement with how you've articulated the fact that we are quite class reductionist and how we kind of model these problems. But something I've been struggling to contend with is that often, instead, we just tack on a variable for identity. So, one of my professors says, if you look at job search models, women are just dumb men, right? Because all we do is we just put some penalty on being a woman. So what I worry about is that structurally, then, we risk being sort of biodeterministic, or there's some sort of racial essentialism that becomes embedded in the ways that we articulate this. And so I was curious about how you think we could resolve structurally, these deeper mechanisms of what race and these social institutions actually do.
Yeah, I love that question, right? So I'm with you. If we think we are feminist scholars, race scholars, or interested in identity, if we go out and pursue a model and then simply put in a binary indicator at the end and argue that that's the effect, that's naive, and furthermore, might even be part of the problem. That might be emphasizing that there's some deficit that we're capturing by putting in this right-hand side variable. If we don't understand, here's the economic term, the endogeneity of all these factors that lead to specific outcomes, then, it's just bad scholarship and also not politically as useful. So, from a macro perspective, one theme I tried to get across in this talk is if you look at politics and economics, race and economics, race and politics, if you look at any of them in isolation or binaries, you're also missing the problem. It is the confluence of all three in most scenarios that need to be analyzed. The thing to think about with Donald Trump, again, is if we reduce it to ignorance, hate, or something else, we're missing the boat. But if we understand that this is a tactic, a weaponization, a tool, a use of a division for some larger political economic goal, I think we better understand it and are capable to redress it.
Thank you.
I just wanted to follow up around something that we discussed around the policies that you're a proponent of. Would you mind laying out the jobs guarantee? We've talked a little bit more throughout this conference today around the purpose of work and what role does all of these different factors play within work. But thinking about the jobs guarantee, I wanted to kind of just have that laid out so we can kind of figure out how that fits into the overall kind of conversation we've been having throughout the day.
Yeah, so a federal job guarantee is literally just that, a right to a job. So the federal government guarantees employment. It will guarantee, so what type of work? It will be work aimed at improving our human and physical infrastructure. Some examples would be the WPA that took place in the New Deal, the CCC that took place in the New Deal. So building our public and physical infrastructure. And if you want to know what jobs we need, we could literally green our whole economy with a federal job guarantee. We could have local communities take stock of their needs because the private sector is not engaging in all the work that we need in order to thrive. And then what it also does is It puts a base on the labor market. It says that if you want to hire workers in this country, you have to offer them at least this. It would reduce the need of a minimum wage. It would, offer people some of the things that Piers and I have with tenure, which is the removal of the threat of unemployment. So with the removal of the threat of unemployment, workers can bargain for better things. It changes the dynamics of power by removing that threat, and it would be used to improve our communities, and it would also get rid of the psychological, physical, and human destruction associated with unemployment.
So one question that keeps coming back to me is there's some part of what you're saying, and you've been saying about the economic message, that I feel like there's some, if I were a Democratic politician from the last, say, 8 years or whatever, I would say that that's in big picture, they've been trying to articulate some of the kinds of things that you're talking about, at least in the big picture, about the dignity of work. I mean, look at Sherrod Brown, for instance, in Ohio, who lost his last election, who's made a kind of broad-based economic message about the dignity of work that he thought would be a kind of a winning message. What I'm asking you about is the message. So maybe you don't agree with what I just said, but my question is, if they were trying to articulate big picture, something in line with what you're saying, what wasn't working as a kind of winning political message in your view? Was it that they weren't articulating the economic message the right way? Was it just that there were other political factors overwhelming the economic message? I know, for instance, you was an advisor to Bernie, who also was trying to make a broad-based economic message that he thought would appeal to working people across the aisle. So I'm just sort of curious, like why hasn't that already taken hold to some extent as a broad-based economic message?
So sadly, politicians like Sherrod Brown are fringe in the Democratic Party. Shout out to him. I thought, one of the other things he proposed was public banking, which is part of this inclusive economic rights frame. It ensures that if you get a paycheck and can't afford the fees and fines associated with owning an account with conventional finance because you don't have enough to put in that bank account to begin with, that you get to cash your check without extractive fees. So I would group Sherrod Brown as one of the more progressive politicians. As to why he lost, hard to explain. I don't know the specific details, but in general, the Democratic Party is the progressive side is fringe. If you ask me, the mainstream vision and articulation is one of tinkering, and it's certainly not ready for the moment, and also culpable in getting us to the moment, right? I'm careful to use the word. It's been the bipartisan consensus that's got us to this moment. But politicians like Bernie Sanders, Sherrod Brown, and many others, that's what we need. We don't have enough of them. And, if I think about, so the Biden administration, at least during the pandemic, did a lot of things, a lot of good things. His first executive order was around even articulating the need for the federal government to measure and account for race. Now, that's a good first step. It didn't have the teeth, but at least it changed the rhetoric towards we're concerned about racial inclusion. But it also was very bad in messaging in a lot of ways, like the Inflation Reduction Act. That bill had nothing to do with inflation. He didn't lean into a lot of the positives from that bill. When they started talking about a new vision for their economy, one of the things they used was they called it a new supply-side economics. They should kill supply-side economics. So I think that we have not had a sustained movement of politicians articulating this vision in such a way for it to have taken hold. One other quick thing I'll say is I was asked a question earlier about what are some of the things that that we can do. I mentioned that Freedom Budget Project. Well, part of what we're thinking, and again, led by Senator Turner, is precision amongst black voters. If we look at some of the geopolitics of the Democratic Party, a lot of the progressive candidates don't get out of South Carolina. Well, in South Carolina, there is a disproportionate share of the party that's black. So we need to appeal and message to that group. I think a lot of the economic rights candidates don't message on race. Black people don't necessarily see them in that vision of economic rights. So one of the things we're strategically trying to do is reassert a history in which they were front and center in that struggle.
So, I mean, please step up if you have a question. I have lots of things I want to ask about, but I don't need to.
We need a bus
to dominate. I know, exactly. Okay, so thinking about the future of work, stepping back a bit. So you're teaching students, I assume. Do you still teach?
Yes.
Okay. When you're giving them advice about what kinds of skills to be developing for the sort of the economy of the future, what are you telling your students?
I think a lot about the absorption of the economy of the future, again, rests in political economy. I think that, we're faced, again, we can go back to AI. We are fearful of job displacement. We know through history, this is not the first moment of its kind, but I don't want to trivialize it because the absorption of technology, the evolution of technology is accelerated today in ways that it hadn't been in the past. So that is true. The looming point about AGI, artificial general intelligence, if it's able to do what some people are predicting, and by the way, we should be even concerned with, we have a great colleague that we work with, Elaine Chang, who's leading this initiative in the Institute, so some of the stuff I'm saying is really parroting her. But we need to be even careful of the political jargon that comes out of AGI because it presents this as inevitable, as a far-gone conclusion. And I've already warned against, like right now, our economy is presented as inevitable and a far-gone conclusion. And that has the effect of muting our political capacities to structure and design how we want to absorb that technology. So there are people who know a lot more about the specificity of the technology than me, but I think what I'm thinking about and concerned with will be even more powerful as to whether it will be extractive or exploitive or empowering. And that is how we absorb it. And if we begin with the first question of the purpose of it and everything that we're going to do around it is to empower people, that will lead to very different outcomes than if we leave it based on a profit motive or some other approach that centers the technology and not people. A classic example in history is the cotton gin. So the cotton gin moved us from an agrarian society to a large extent to an industrial society. Well, it happened in the political economic context of slavery, and it exacerbated that slave system, probably led to its continuation longer than it otherwise would have, and was horrific for a lot of people. So I guess I would teach the students, I'm not an engineer, but I would continue to teach my students to think about political economy writ large and question and define the purposes that they want and try to engage in ways that structure our government so that we can absorb and control resources in a way that's aimed at human flourishing.
And the way you see the sort of technology developing is, so it's part of the kind of same analysis in the sense you don't see, for instance, the availability of generative AI to people as something that in and of itself is going to be something that drives a kind of shift in the workforce towards something more egalitarian or something like that, it's really going to require sort of careful management by, say, a governmental policy.
Yeah, I mean, again, this might be trite, but 2 call centers in Germany, the AI is often facilitating the receivers of the calls and ways to empower them to deal with the call that they find incoming. In America, the calls go directly to the AI entity and are routed in such a way that's aimed at division of labor, remunerative things where somebody is specialized in only giving, say, what is your account balance? Do you have a human being that's what they do all day long? Well, that person is getting no skill training. That person is very vulnerable in a job that they probably find not empowering, not endearing, that they probably hate. So those are, and again, it might be a trite example, so in fairness to the question you asked, but 2 clear examples of 2 types of call centers where one, the AI is being used to empower the worker, the other is the AI is being used to extract from the worker. In terms of what jobs will emerge as a result of AI, I have no idea. I know from history that we've been in similar situations and we had similar fears about technology disrupting society in such a way that new work would not emerge. And we ended up with new things that people had no idea in how to predict. So again, I think it's certainly something that we should be obviously concerned with. Certainly things that some people need to be expert in trying to develop. But if we're thinking only about regulation, if we're not thinking about vision and defining its purpose, it will indeed be exploitive and extractive, and history tells us that as well.
I think that wasn't the most uplifting point to end, but there's actually, I think, a lot of hope underlying the analysis from Dr. Hamilton. So please join me in thanking him for being here.